Hello. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Will.
So this is so exciting to be here. First, before I introduce myself and Gary Gulman, I'm going to say to everybody, welcome to Gary Gulman's live signing. This is hosted by Premiere, and you'll see on screen the website for Premiere Collectibles.com/misfit. So if you want to order your very own autographed copy of Gary's extraordinary book, Misfit, go to that and I'll be reminding you of that. So I'm Will Schwalbe. I am an author and an editor, and I'm not just a editor, I'm the editor of Gary Gulman's extraordinary book, Misfit, his memoir, just out yesterday. And I have so much to say about Gary, but I'm going to cheat and just read a little bit from the back flap of the book, which is that Gary Gulman is one of the most popular touring comics, selling out theaters nationwide, including Carnegie Hall. He has been a guest on every major late night comedy program. His 4 comedy specials include HBO's The Great Depresh, a highly acclaimed look at mental illness. In 2019, he appeared in the international blockbuster Joker. He has a recurring role on the Hulu comedy series Life and Beth. A product of Boston, Gulman was previously a scholarship college football player, an accountant, and a high school teacher. Misfit is his first guy, and he is a prince. Hello, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you, Will. That is so nice. I'm so excited. I'm usually on the other side of these author signings where I sit in the audience and I've seen some great authors, Ray Bradbury. I got an autograph at a bookstore, and James Elroy and David Sedaris. And so this is almost surreal to be on the other side of the table.
It's so fun. There's something about autographed copies. I love them, and I though we've been working together for a couple of years, I need to get your John Hancock on mine. So I want to start before we go to all the marvelous questions that have come in with a kind of obvious one. Of course, you're a writer because you write this extraordinary material, but I'd love to hear you talk about what it meant to write a book and your feelings about books.
Well, it's interesting. I have a reverence for books that I developed so early on. I remember my mom giving me this phrase where she said, "You're never alone if you have a book." And I was alone a lot, but I also had a good library, and I always had books. So I was never completely alone. And so I've always, ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to write my own book. In fact, I did in second grade. I wrote a book called The Lonely Tree, which was a clear allegory for a very lonely boy, and it was a fir tree who became the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. And I think if we had added a subtitle to it, it would have been The Lonely Tree: A Cry for Help. So I've always loved writing, and I've loved reading. And so I think the thing that maybe held me back, and I've never discussed this with you, was that in the back of my head was this idea that if I was going to write a book, I had to hold myself up to this high bar of the books I had read, which is a very intimidating idea when you think about it, for your first book to be able to hold up to people that we love and admire. So I've always wanted to write a book. And then after The Great Depresh came out, I met Will and Bob Miller at Macmillan, and we hit it off right away. And it was just, it was one of the most joyful experiences of my life. I know writers are supposed to lament every bit of writing and feel it's this arduous, painstaking chore. And there were moments of that, certainly. But overall, it was this wonderful process of expression, and I went into it with somebody who was such a great, gentle, patient mentor in Will. So I'm truly grateful for everyone involved, but especially Will in editing and giving me kind of a master's class in memoir writing, and putting me to the right books and essays to read about writing to give me guidance.
Well, that was one of the reasons it was such a joy to work with you. Is you are such a reader and you have such a reverence for books. And at the language level, this book is miraculous. The sentences, the turns of phrase, the little things that make you smile or tug at your throat. But so for language, and anybody who loves your comedy knows how beautiful and thoughtful you are about language. One of the other extraordinary things about this memoir is, frankly, your memory and the level of detail. And I'd love for you to talk a bit about that.
Well, I think partly in wanting to be a writer since I was little, I was always taking mental notes and keeping track of things, especially sort of the sensory types things, the smells, the feelings in my stomach, and also the sounds were very resonant with me. And so I was careful to add those types of details into the book. But I think my memory works best when there is something either traumatic or joyful involved in the event. So trauma leaves an impression on me, and then because I spent a lot of my time in sort of a low grade depression at the best, whenever there were moments of joy or elation, those things would really make an impression on me. And so I was recalling this last night at my show. I remember the song that was playing the first time I had my first kiss, and also the smell of the house, because they had dogs and a cigarette smoker in the house, and it really left an impression on me that I also had this habit of thinking to myself in certain experiences and events, I would think, I will never forget this. I will never forget this. And usually those were joyful moments. Occasionally they were things that I knew I was going to struggle to get out of my mind, but a lot of the times they were joyful. And so I'm glad I was able to uphold that bargain I made with myself at the time when I said, I'll remember this for the rest of my life.
It's wonderful. It really comes through. And there's so many strands to this book. It's so rich. It's a book for anybody who grew up awkward. It's a book about the 80s. It's a book about family. But it's a book people who've struggled. But it's also, to use that expression, laugh out loud funny. And you see the evolution of a comic. And I'm going to put you on the spot, and you can say no. But okay, as you're finding your way as a young comic, as a kid making other kids laugh, you mentioned a routine you did called Lifestyles of the Broke and Hopeless.
Yes,
talk about that.
I resented the show Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous because it had such a hold on my family. We were working class, poor type people, and my mother and my brothers, they would watch that show. And so I went around the house one day with a boombox. It was enormous to carry this thing, recording things. And I did this impression of Robin Leach, the host, which any amateur comedian can do a pretty good Robin Leach. So I would say, we examine the Gulman's shower where there is a bar of soap that has been added countless times to slivers of soap, making it into a hodgepodge of dial, ivory, and Irish spring, a work of art that would feel at home in the Louvre.
Fantastic. Oh my goodness. Yep. All right. I see where it all began. I'm getting it. Wow. So I want to move on to, we've got all these great questions that have come in for you, but I'll also be sprinkling some more in as well. I'm going to read the voices of the questioners. So Gary, Gare, can I call you Gare? I feel like we're on Gare terms. So Gare.
People call me Gare.
Gare. What's the connection between depression and humor? Is it always a way out? Is there any sense that the opposite is true, that can have an identity rooted in a need to perform can also be a cause of depression? Thanks. And the person gives his name, Andy Brownstein, says you can call him And.
And that is a great question. I think that as a coping mechanism, humor is really helpful in that chemically, I'm sure when you laugh, you are getting a rush of endorphins, dopamine, and serotonin. I think I've heard that said. But also when you make other people laugh, and I wonder if it has any connection to the feeling you get really when you do any act of service for a person, a stranger, or a friend. There's a feeling. I remember Mark Twain, and I have this on a magnet. It says, if you want to cheer yourself up, cheer somebody else up. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's a chemical component of that. So I would say that if you're laughing, or if you're funny and depressed, you will go to that well a lot. So it'll become a coping mechanism. I do not know that it's possible that I probably became addicted to the feeling and the excitement of making people laugh. That's possible, but I really think, I don't think comedians are any more likely to be depressed. I think they're 100% more likely to tell you they're depressed. I think that's part of it. I think you're I don't want to say regular, but maybe your accountant or your lawyer may be depressed, but it's not as acceptable for your accountant or lawyer to say, hey, I couldn't get out of bed today, and I really half-assed this job of yours, so please forgive me. I'm very ill right now. So I think that's part of it. I also think that these things run in family, and I think families tend to, depressed families tend to encourage these short reliefs and the solace you get from laughing as a family. Great question, Andy.
That's one, as a corollary to Andy or Anne's question. Do you know any comedians who had a very happy childhood or an entirely happy childhood?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard Jay Leno and Jerry Seinfeld say that they had very happy childhoods, and you'll notice they tend to not open up about any kind of personal things, or give you the inside scoop on their inner workings. But I know that most of the comedians that I really enjoyed growing up, your Gary Shandlings, your Richard Lewises, and your David Brenners, they had very, very quirky, or what's the word for dysfunctional? How do I lose the word dysfunctional? Most words I have access to, I lose dysfunctional. But yeah, a dysfunctional family is not required, but it's a nice help in being a comedian.
Great. All right. The next question. Hi, Gary. Today is my 40th birthday. Any advice for my 40s? Thank you.
Well, I think the one thing I learned while writing this, or maybe it was reinforced, and this was really helpful, and you'll have to wait for the coda if you're reading it. So this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, but one thing I found along the way, where there were so many things in my life that initially were overwhelming and caused me great stress. And it started with reading. That didn't cause me great stress, but I didn't think I'd ever be able to learn how to read. I couldn't make the connection. And then one day at the end of kindergarten, I put everything together that I had learned from Sesame Street and the Electric Company. And the next thing I knew, I was running through Grover's The Monster at the End of This Book. So then it was tying my shoes, zippering a jacket, and everything seemed to be really difficult. Playing basketball, I couldn't make shots, and asking out a woman in high school, all these things that I never thought I would be able to do later became things I did easily and without a second thought, or at least without being overwhelmed by them. It's always going to be anxiety provoking to ask someone out on a date. So I learned, and then the ultimate reinforcement was when I first started writing the book, there were parts of me that said, how are you ever going to finish this? You've never written a book. You keep just reading these books and they all say how hard it is. And so I learned once again, and it was reinforced, that I will figure it out. And that's such a great approach I've found to facing things that initially seem very difficult and even overwhelming. The other thing is, as you enter your 40th year, is that at 53, I look at somebody at 40 and I say, oh my gosh, you are so young. So keep reminding yourself that you are very young. You are too old to play professional basketball or in the NFL or Major League Baseball for the most part, if you haven't already been playing for 20 years. But everything else in the world is open to you, especially love and finding a creative outlet and a rewarding career. So enjoy is what I say to your 40s.
That's such a great message. I'm 61, and I think that's advice that I can put into practice for my 60s as well. So the next question. Hi, Gary. I can't wait to read the book. As an awkward, depressed Hebrew school student of the 80s without many friends, I'm curious to see how others remember those days. I attended your Great Depresh show in Wilmington, Delaware, when someone in the audience decided to speak up. The way you shut him down gives the rest of us hope. Congratulations.
Oh, my word. Well, that night, and the name of the show was The Great Depression, a man sitting in the front, he had excellent seats, was huffing and harumphing throughout the show. And I finally acknowledged him and I said, is everything okay? And he says, what is this, therapy? and I said, well, I indicated that this was about mental illness with the title. And also, it hasn't all been therapy. There have been a lot of jokes in there. And I told him that maybe he would be better off to sit the rest of it out. And he left, and everybody applauded. And I think it was something that reinforced me rather than deterred me, which was a really good thing to find about myself, that I didn't get overwhelmed or discouraged or worried that would happen everywhere I went. And it was several months before I shot this special, and it was just this great moment where I had faced just the worst thing that can happen to you, is this ultimate rejection. And I said, well, if this were to happen on the night of the show, it would actually be a tremendous gift. But it didn't happen, but I was prepared for it. So I'm really grateful that you remember that and that you reached out about this. And I will say that the older I get, the more people I intersect with who get us and know where we're coming from. And one of the greatest things was to open up about how I feel and the loneliness and things like that. And then almost like a magnet, it attracts people who are like-minded, and it's very edifying. So I would say you're very strong, and to keep hanging in there and be patient. There are a lot of us out there.
The next question is, will Born on Third Base and Misfit, Born on Third Base being the name of the show you most recently toured with, and Misfit, the current show you're touring with, of course, will those shows be available on a streaming service or YouTube?
I know that Born on Third Base, either under that name or something different, will be available. So the material from that I recorded in Toronto as a special over the summer, that will be available. And Misfit, I've gotten to a level where I think every one of my tours, I can get somebody to put it up as a special, which is a really a thing I'm very grateful for. So I will say Born on Third Base, definitely. Misfit, probably 90%. So, but thank you.
Great. Here's a question. Who was the last band or performer you saw live?
I saw Michael Franti and Spearhead in Connecticut. And Michael Franti was somebody I admired. And then I had admired him since I was in my 20s, because he was also the frontman for a hip hop band called the Disposable Heroes of Hypocrisy, which was this unusual band that was so politically conscious and progressively minded, but in hip hop at a time when there were a lot of bands saying some really special, interesting things. And so, but I remember they stood out. And then he has this band now that's a rock band, but there's also reggae influences. And so anyhow, he reached out to me on Instagram and invited me to his show, and my wife came and he gave me a shout out, and it was one of the greatest moments of my life. And it was just a really communal feeling at the show, because his fans are so devoted and he is so warm and giving. He was very for this book tour, I was inspired by Michael Franti's generosity with his fans, as well as David Sedaris, who I saw at the King's Theater last summer, and he just signs and meets and greets, and it's just so inspiring. And so I'm trying to give the people that type of experience with the book tour this year.
So great. What was the first performer you ever saw, or first band?
I think when I was 17, my dad took me to see Jay Leno at the North Shore Music Theater in Beverly, Massachusetts. So it was comedy that was my first live show. And then later on, I think I saw in college, I think I saw Billy Joel.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Have you been back to see Billy Joel?
Oh, numerous times. Yeah, a couple of times at Madison Square Garden and at Fenway Park. So yeah, I've always loved him.
Great. This is a question about grooming. Of all your various hairstylings, which should truly be called the Gulman?
Oh my gosh. Somebody was saying, actually, Joni from the book, my mom's best friend Joni, or one of her best friends. I don't want to shade Auntie Judy. Joni said, you have a different hairstyle in every appearance, every special. There's a different hairstyle, and I would say I'm most impressed by the mullet I had in college for my football picture, where it flows past my helmet and everything. That always gets the biggest reaction of shock and awe. But I would say that the length, I feel like this is a pretty cute length, and I'd like to maintain around this length. But there's no hairstyle I look back on and think, oh, what a fool, except for the mullet. That's the one where I said, oh man, I shouldn't have leaned into the current hairstyle of the time, because it doesn't really hold up. But I'm sure there are a lot of people in every era who regret their hair choices.
Yeah, the 80s were known for the hair choices, right?
Yeah.
And then this person who asked this question adds that they love seeing you in Madison, and it was his birthday.
That I love performing in Madison. I find that the closer my act gets to a town with a university that I couldn't have gotten into, I find my act does the best in those places. So Cambridge, Madison, Wisconsin, Berkeley, I kill it there. There are so many smart people and professors and things like that, and I really connect with them.
So here's a question. As you have traveled around learning the ropes and system called the comedy circuit, how do you feel life in Peabody, Mass, football, JCC life, basketball in the park as a kid prepared you for what the rest of the country throws at you? Go Tanners.
This is a great question. And I don't want to correct you on air, Will, but it's pronounced Peabody.
Peabody. Sorry.
Peabody. It's sort of it's a shibboleth to keep people out who are not from Peabody or the North Shore. So I would say the great thing that every aspect of my childhood prepared me for, especially sports and my schooling, was that I noticed that I was very fortunate in that I had enough talent and intelligent DNA that if I worked really hard, if I worked harder than everyone else, I would stand out in the pursuits that I was passionate about. And that's such a great lesson that sports or performing in a band or playing an instrument or singing or anything, chess, that requires practice, discipline, and dedication. So I found that I was never going to be the most naturally talented comedian or writer, but I could outwork people. I was pretty disciplined, and especially for a comedian, I was very disciplined, because a lot of the younger comedians were very active in the social and bar scene, and I was very capable of eschewing that in favor of staying up late writing and going to shows and performing, and also I was pretty extroverted in that, and that was very helpful, because some comedians are introverted and they have a hard time making friends, and they always say it's not show friends, it's show business, but it's really show friends. I've gotten a lot of the work and a lot of the help from being a good friend to people who are good friends in turn, and so I've been very fortunate in that respect.
The next question is, hey Gar, my first time ever seeing you perform was on the show Tourgasm. I assume I can say that on air. Almost 20 years ago at this point. I was curious if you had any particular thoughts or memories about that show. I remember you being the funniest of the bunch and being disappointed that you had to leave. Love seeing you at Sacred Heart a week ago. You're the best.
Oh, wow. That's so nice. I have a mixture of fond memories and misery associated with that tour. I don't do well in other people's orbit, and it's partly ego and partly insecurity. So at the time, the leader of the show, Dane Cook, was one of the biggest stars in comedy history, and I just felt like an afterthought in many ways. And I remember thinking about different basketball stars who had played with Michael Jordan, and I tried to look at their careers as inspiration. I remember thinking to myself, well, Scottie Pippen felt good about himself, even though he wasn't Michael Jordan, and played on those teams, and so it took a lot of intestinal fortitude to handle the blow to my ego that thing was, but I have fond memories of it, and I'm really glad that you remember it fondly too.
Tourgasm. It's a word that's now entered my vocabulary.
That was an HBO series. Yeah.
I'll look it up. Now this is another. No, I will not look it up. This is another question that you're going to have to do some explaining for the listeners.
Okay.
Gary, there is one. Sid Abel, played on the same line as Gordie Howe. He'd appreciate the mention. I can't thank you enough for the laughs over the years.
Okay, so I think he's saying that there's a Jewish man in the Hockey Hall of Fame, I'm assuming.
Okay.
And that's possible, but I imagine they would have covered that in some of the books I've read about Jewish athletic stars, but I will take your word for it, and I will look it up at the conclusion of this live signing, and thank you for your gentleness in the correction, because my insecurity frequently makes me lash out at criticism.
Now, do you want to explain the section of the book why the topic of Jewish hockey players comes up?
Well, I don't know if that's in the book, because it was in my act, and one of the things that I was careful about was that when I first started comedy, there were a spate of famous comedians writing books where they would basically type up their act and bind it and then sell it to me, and I remember feeling bilked out of my 1995, and so I didn't want to. And I remember in our first meeting, I said I don't want to just type up my act, and so I was very careful about that. But the joke I do in my act is about the fact that I wanted to be a hockey star when I was a kid, and my dad said that more Jews have been the Messiah than have made the Hockey Hall of Fame. He said you're more likely to walk on water than you are to skate on it.
Got it. Now I feel better too, because I was feeling sort of gently corrected for having fact checked this. So I was worried, but I'm feeling much, much better. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, oh, this is a fun question about the audio. How difficult was it to complete the audio version of the book? Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers said reading his aloud was very powerful and emotional.
Wow. I love Flea, and that is so nice to hear, because he wrote a great memoir, and I agree with that. And I wouldn't have told anybody that, because I wouldn't say I was embarrassed by it, but I thought it was a unique experience. Although now that I hear that, and I remember the director, Caitlin Davies, was so nice. She said, we've had it all, laughing, crying, everything. There's no reason to be ashamed or anything like that. But it was really emotional, and there were moments where I laughed very hard, because what people don't understand about writing a book is you could sometimes go months without reading certain chapters because it's been behind you so long, and then you come across it and said, I don't even remember writing that. And it's only the fact that I would find it in my notes that I said, oh no, I wrote that. And then there were moments at the end, especially the coda, where it's, what have you learned with your life? And also the acknowledgments when I'm thanking these people who were so generous to me and so kind to me, that I became overcome with tears. And there were other moments, and it was I'm really glad Flea reinforced that in my head, because yes, it was a wonderful experience. It was not that difficult because I had a really good director and engineer, and we had a lot of time. And I speak on stage frequently. So I've studied acting since I was in my 20s. So I know my way a little bit around motivation and things. But the Caitlin Davies was just such a great find in directing me. I loved the process, and it was also the first time in many years that I had set hours for a job that were during the day. It was pretty cool.
like a working man, you had to come in, clock in.
Yeah. Lunch pail in hand from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day from Monday through Friday. It was really cool.
That's so great. Did your voice hold up over the 3 days?
Pretty good. By the third or fourth day, I think that I had to do more warm-up exercises to get some of the croakiness out of my voice, but I think it held up well. I'm sure there will be, if I were to listen to it, I would say, oh, this was definitely from the fourth day.
So this is, hey, Gary, I was wondering how you refine new material. I know musicians jam, magicians perform for each other first, and many other performers have coaches. How does it work in comedy?
Well, when I first started out, I would think of an idea and then spend hours and days writing it up, and then I would put it on stage and work it out that way, record every set, go back to the drawing board. Now I'm at a level where I can go on stage for an hour or two, and I just go on with sentences and premises, and I work it out that way. But again, I listen to the recordings and I take notes and I expand. And I would say this is great advice to anybody in a comedy sketches or stand-up comedy. Listen to your sets, because it gets you to do the hardest thing, which is sit down with your notebook open and a pen in your hand. And you just tell yourself, I'll just write down the things that I find interesting, compelling, funny, that the audience liked. And invariably you will think of other things, and it will expand your act and your jokes and make everything better. And you'll also be able to hear the different verbal tics that we all have, the ums and the you knows and the likes and those types of things. So it's really important, and it's not easy. It's the hardest part, is listening to yourself, but it's worth every minute.
And what about going about your daily life in terms of capturing thoughts, ideas? What's your system?
It used to be a notebook on me all the time, and now it's my phone's notes apps, where I'll write down to myself or text to myself ideas and sentences. Or if I'm driving, I'll call my wife and say, hey, can you write down the time that you asked me what the name of this song was and who plays it, and I then gave you a 2-hour dissertation on the grunge movement and named every member of Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, and Pearl Jam, and then assigned some reading. And it's just, ever since I was a little kid, I wanted everybody to know that I knew everything, and it never ends.
Is that filed under a folder that is Sade is a saint? Because that's where I would stick that.
Saint, and all she said was, "Who sings this?" And then there's a lecture on the grunge movement.
Oh my goodness. Here is a question. I'm very excited for your book, Fist Bump from a Fellow 80s Misfit. I'm wondering how your process compared with writing stand-up material. What were the biggest differences you found? This is between writing a book and writing your stand-up.
That is a great question. It wasn't harder or easier. It was similar in that I've always wanted my comedy to work on the page, and I don't know why. I think it's either aesthetically or just this thing where you get good at something and then you want to challenge yourself to make it harder. And so I always wanted my jokes to work in a way that you could read them and say, oh, this is interesting because it has assonance and there's thought put into the word choices and the rhythm of it. And I'm not comparing it to poetry, but those are the types of things that I always enjoyed about great writing, is there was a poetry to it. So when I put my voice on the page, I was also, there's a lot of, and Will was really great at teaching me about this, reading it out loud so that you understand the assonance. And then with the rise of audiobooks, that's just great advice because you're going to have to read this aloud. So I was careful to make it sound good off the page and look good on the page. And also, I mean, one of my favorite things to do is the rewrite of a joke that works and making it work a little bit better. So then you go onto the page with an editor's mind, but also sort of I guess this is probably a bad analogy, but a florist trying to make this bouquet a little bit better and arranging it, or a composer trying to arrange instruments and making these words work, and then adding allusions and maybe a secondary meaning of a word. And there was one thing that was really, I loved that moment where I said a few raindrops into April, and there was an origin to it that we had erased from the book, and Will said, no, I like the sound of that, even though we're not clear on the fact that the teacher used to put raindrops as every day in the month of April. And he said it works without that. And it was a really fun Easter egg discovery. And so there's all these things. It was just, it's, if you look at a book or a joke as a puzzle, I think it's a really fun approach. And also this idea that I talked about earlier in this talk, which is I'll figure it out. Many times I would go to bed thinking, please, subconscious, solve this riddle, this puzzle in chapter 6th and 7th grade that I haven't been able to figure out, and beat my head against the typewriter all day long. And then I'd wake up the next morning and think, oh, this sentence will solve it. Or sometimes Will would ask me the right question and I would solve it. So the other thing I learned from doing the Great Depression and this book is that collaboration and having a good reader and somebody to a soundboard for your ideas, and a gentle, patient, generous person is invaluable.
Well, it's interesting in terms of both things. One observation I made is it's rare to, there's this classic phrase in writing, kill your darlings, which means get rid of little bits that you love that don't work anymore. They're your darlings. They're not going to be the readers. And this may come from your stand-up or just from you, but you are astonishingly willing to jettison things that aren't working.
Yes, 100%. I'll tell you why. It gives a great message to your brain, which is, I call it the Doritos theory, which Doritos said, crunch all you want, we'll make more. And I I tell my brain, throw out all the great jokes, you'll come up with better ones, and throw out the great sentences, and it's a great message. I think it was Maya Angelou said something to the effect, and I hope I'm not butchering this paraphrase. You can't run out of creativity. The more you use, the more you have. And I just, that was one of the things I put on my wall when I moved back into my mother's house, was this idea, because I thought, oh, I've written my best joke, and it's going to be so hard to come up with a new hour. But I put that up on the wall, and I think the subconscious is even more powerful than we think.
Wow. So I'd have to look. That's such a marvelous quote. I love the Dorito. I'll have to look up that quote you on that Doritos. This is a fun question. When are you making your Broadway debut? Because I haven't heard it yet, but word on the street is that Gary Gulls has pipes.
There are moments in my act. There was a scene in the book that I had a lot of fun. I don't remember whether I was able to use a real song because of the copyrights, but there were times during high school and college football practice where we were doing this warm-up exercise that looked like a very intricate choreographed dance, and I would sing, I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair, and nobody laughed. But in my head I was like, how can you not be singing while doing this absurd dance that looks like something out of 42nd Street?
So we're just going to have to hope that there's some Broadway producers of musical comedy theater watching the premiercollectibles.com/misfit event, because I think it's the rest will be history. There is something fun provided by our friends here who let me see if I can get to, which is, I may or may not be able to. Yes. So this is a kind of a lightning round. So I haven't seen these questions, so I'm going to read them, ask them to you, and the first thing that comes into your head, some you should know, some require some creativity. Where were you born?
I was born at Hunt Hospital in Danvers, Massachusetts on July 17th, 1970.
Who would you like to play you in a movie?
Adrian Brody.
What was your first job?
My first job was I sold baseball cards with a man who ran the carpet and furniture department at the Sears that my mother worked. Al Forbes was my boss, and I was 11 years old, and I sold baseball cards at baseball card shows and flea markets.
What chore do you hate doing?
I don't know that there's any chore that I hate doing. I do know that I love ironing. I think that it gives it's zen. I think I love making a wrinkle go away, and I'm amazed at how soothing that act is. So I do love ironing, and I have a good vacuum, and I love vacuuming the carpet. We kept the carpet from the Great Depresh that was on the set of the Great Depresh, and it's in our living room. So I get to vacuum that and relive one of the great moments of my life.
Gosh, I wish I'd known about the ironing. I would have brought shirts along with sections of edited manuscript, but on our next book. What is your biggest fear?
My biggest fear is that this incredible run of success and warmth will dry up. If I could just keep on going the way I am right now, I would be so content and grateful. I've never had such a long run of mental health in my life, and I'm just so grateful. But also I'm very vigilant about maintaining it. So that's a big part of my day is doing things like I already played basketball for several hours before we had this, because exercise is a big part of my regimen.
That's great. I loved, by the way, seeing you. CBS Saturday Morning did a fantastic segment about you and showed you shooting hoops, which was very joyful.
That felt like an infomercial for being friends with me. It was so nice.
Now, this is a question I will answer before you, because the question is, Who makes you laugh the most? My answer is Gary Gulman. What is your answer?
Chris Elliott. Chris Elliott from The Letterman Show and Get a Life and Schitt's Creek. On and off stage, I actually became friends with him after the Great Depression. We reached out to him, and he invited us, myself and my director, to his home in Maine, and we spent a night, and he cooked for us and kept us up after 1 a.m. laughing with the stories and his characters. It was a dream come true, literally.
Wow. What is the one thing you need to have in your refrigerator at all times?
Iced coffee. I'm addicted to caffeine.
Iced coffee. What is your favorite school subject?
English. I love to read. I love books. I would spend 4 hours a day on my book and then another 4 hours reading. I know a lot of authors don't like to read while they're writing, and I will say sometimes I would say, I remember while reading Grapes of Wrath, I would think to myself, why am I even bothering? The best sentences have already been taken. But I find reading to be very helpful, and also listening to books. I think as a writer of comedy or of books and literature, I think it's important to bathe your brain in words and sentences as often as you can. And Stephen King will back me up on that in his book on writing, where he lists all the books he read, and he's just an avid reader. I think it was him who said a good writer has to be a good reader.
And I can attest to that, because if you mention a book to Gary Gulman, he will have it read by the next time you talk to him.
Sharing a book is such a great connection. Sharing a comedian, but also a book is a great connection.
Who is the most interesting person you met recently?
Gee whiz, the most interesting person I met recently, I would say, interestingly enough, it was probably Michael Franti, because he had me in his bus, and he told me this story about opening for U2 in the 90s when he was in the hip hop group. And he said that Bono told him how powerful a pop song can be. And I of course extrapolated that to my own life. And it just reminds me of this idea that we can aspire to making great poignancy and intricate and complex writing, but the bottom line is that a small amount of entertainment and joy can be very powerful in making people's struggle a little bit more manageable, or in providing relief. So it takes a lot of pressure off saying really important things. You can just say things from the heart and say lovely things or funny things or things that make you smile, and it's powerful.
Great. Now I'm going to end with two of these questions. One quite serious, and the other something that speaks to the heart of writing. So the more serious one is, can you tell us about a cause that is near and dear to your heart?
Well, I read a book by Peter Singer about the effective altruism movement, and it just talked about using our extra money, whatever you may consider your extra money, to literally save lives. So in it recommended a number of different charities, but one program that was very interesting was something called givewell.org, in which they did extensive research and sort of ranked the charities, which I hate rankings of things, especially when they're positive things like art or charities. But I think a lot of people have kind of a business orientation to where their money is going with charities, and it just gives great outlines. So I found a charity that provides vitamin A to children in Africa to keep them from going blind, but also to keep them alive. It's what I hate to say bang for your buck, but it's a very effective and efficient way to save lives. And so every month I give a donation of a certain percentage over what I can afford to pay rent and all these things. And so I'm a true believer in the effective altruism movement. And again, it also makes me feel good. So there's a selfish part of this. It makes me feel good to give and share. So I would say that's a cause that's very important to me, but also in general, mental health. I try to do any kind of benefit or talk about my journey and my recovery. And because I know that it gives people hope to see me. I used to think certain people, I would say, well, if I remember a famous football player named Terry Bradshaw talked about being depressed. And I said, well, if Terry Bradshaw feels depressed, then it's not about accomplishment or achievement. It's a chemical thing. And I realized recently that to some people, I am their Terry Bradshaw. So I feel okay about sharing it, and that I'm not burdening people. It gives them some feelings of feeling less alone, and also that there's hope on the other side of this debilitating disease.
Well, I think this, you know how crazy I am about this book, and this book does all of that and more. And some of the comments that have been flooding in have been people not just saying that it cracked them up and that there were stories that they couldn't wait to read each other and making each other laugh nonstop, but also so many people writing and saying it made them feel less alone. It made them feel heard. It says the way you trace things back through childhood. So final question is, do you have a favorite word? And if so, what is it?
Well, in high school, and I can't believe we didn't include this in the book, I loved the word gauche. Whenever anybody would be doing something or wearing something tacky, I would say to a friend of mine, Kevin Lamasny, I would say, ugh, how gauche. And I think he probably introduced me to the term, but I went crazy with that term. So that was my favorite word. But as an adult, I find my favorite word is the word ineffable, which means unable to be described by words. And I don't use it nearly enough, but occasionally I will get to use it, and it makes me very happy when it comes out. It's a great sounding word, and it also it's kind of a cop-out in that it's a word that says there are no words, and I think it's sort of this paradoxical word. So I adore that word.
Great. Well, thank you. This just remind everybody, this has been Gary Gulman's live signing hosted by Premier. You can buy signed books, premiercollectibles.com/misfit. And Gary, this has been the opposite of gauche. This has been ineffable. So thank you very much.
Fun. I will use any excuse to hang around with you, Will. And this was great. It was great talking to you. And thank you again for providing me with a masterclass in memoir writing and also kind and generous support.
Oh, thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Hey, this is John Acuff, New York Times best-selling author of 7 books and someone who's done a live signing. If you like the one you just watched, make sure you check out our YouTube channel. It's full of amazing authors having great conversations and signing books for viewers just like you. So make sure you subscribe, and thanks for watching today.